The humid air in the grain belt meats warehouse hung heavy, thick with the smell of brine and fear. Steve Caldwell, his face a mask of false concern, leaned in close. "You know, Emily," he whispered loud enough for a few coworkers to stiffen, "your shifts are like my cargo. I decide where they go and who gets to handle them." He winked, a slow, predatory blink that left her exposed, suddenly chilled. Her stomach twisted, an icy dread beginning to spread. Emily drove the old Impala through Harmony, Ohio, the street lights reflecting off the wet pavement after a brief afternoon shower. The scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke drifted in through the open window. Caldwell's voice, a low, oily whisper from the supply closet, still scraped against her nerves. "Your shifts are like my cargo, Emily. I decide where they go." It was unsettling, not just the words, but the way his breath had brushed her ear. That evening, the kitchen light cast a warm yellow glow over their small table. Tom ate his meatloaf without much talk, as he usually did after a long day at the construction site. Emily picked at her peas, pushing them around the plate with her fork. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Finally, she looked up. "Caldwell said something today." Tom stopped chewing, his jaw tightening. "He said my shifts were like his cargo. Said he decided where they went." Tom's fork clattered softly onto his plate. His eyes, usually warm and tired, were now still and cold, like river ice. He didn't speak, but the air around him grew thick with a quiet, palpable rage. Their life in Harmony was simple, built on hard work and shared expectations. Emily worked at the local dry goods store. Tom drove a truck for Midwest builders. They had saved enough for a small down payment on their house, a faded two-story near the edge of town, but their finances were always tight. The future, a comfortable life with a family, depended on them both working, depending on them keeping what they had. A few months prior, the dry goods store closed its doors, leaving Emily without a job. The uncertainty had pressed down on them both. When she landed a position at Heartland Logistics, a large distribution center on the outskirts of town, a fragile relief settled over their house. It was a good wage, steady hours. But that relief had started to unravel. Within weeks, a quiet tension had begun to coil in Emily's shoulders. She'd come home more tired, less talkative. One Tuesday night, after Tom had turned off the TV, she finally spoke. "He keeps making comments, Tom." Her voice was low, almost a murmur. "Caldwell, he talks about his cargo, about how important it is to keep things tight on the night shifts." She wouldn't meet his gaze, instead looking at the small crack in the ceiling plaster. "He touched my arm, twice, just to explain a route map." Emily had tried to put a stop to it. One afternoon in the narrow aisle between stacks of boxes, she told Caldwell directly, "My job here is about moving product, nothing else." He had smiled, a slow, knowing pull of his lips. For a fleeting second, his eyes had changed, a cold, hard glint appearing, like a mask slipping. Then it was gone, replaced by a casual shrug. "Just trying to be friendly, Emily. Don't take it the wrong way." The retaliation was swift and calculated. The next schedule posted, Emily was on nights. Harder work, less light, less supervision. A week later, a formal warning appeared in her file, citing a documentation error she knew she hadn't made. The flimsy paper felt like a slap. Tom, his face etched with concern, had pushed her. "You have to report him, Em. This isn't right." He paced their small living room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Emily sat on the worn sofa, shaking her head. "His family owns the company, Tom, Heartland Logistics. Reporting him would be useless. It would just make it worse. We can't afford to lose this job. Not now." Her voice was tight, a thin thread of desperation in it. The thought of losing her income, of the savings dwindling further, made her feel physically sick. Tom stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. A stillness settled over him, a cold determination. "Okay," he said, the word barely a whisper. "Then I'll go in." Emily frowned, confused. "Go in where?" "The factory, grain belt meats, the warehouse next door. I'll get a job there, get close to him." Her mouth dropped open. "Are you insane? You have a good job, Tom." He looked at her then, his gaze unwavering. "We need to know what he's doing, who else he's doing it to, before it gets worse for you." Emily argued, pleaded, called it a ridiculous, dangerous idea. But Tom's resolve was set. She eventually relented, but laid down strict rules. No confronting him, Tom. You stay quiet. You just listen. And you do nothing that puts your real job at risk. Nothing. The next day, Tom secured a month's leave from Pete, his boss at Midwest Builders, citing a family emergency out of state. Within a week, the transformation began. He cut his hair shorter, shaved his beard, bought a few faded denim shirts at the thrift store. He practiced a new name in the mirror, letting it roll off his tongue. Dan Miller, a recently divorced warehouse worker, new to Harmony, looking for a fresh start. Grain Belt Meats was always hiring. The work was brutal, cold. Dan was pushing pallets of packaged chicken into refrigerated trucks within days. The air in the loading dock was permanently chilled, a metallic tang of blood and disinfectant clinging to everything. His hands were raw by the end of the first week, his back a constant ache. Randy, a stocky loader with a permanent sweat sheen on his forehead, watched Dan struggle with a particularly heavy carton. "You'll get used to it," he grunted, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Though Caldwell makes it harder than it needs to be for some folks." Dan pushed the heavy pallet, feigning disinterest. "Oh yeah?" Randy spit a stream of tobacco juice onto the concrete. "Yeah, there was a girl, Lisa, worked in shipping, refused his advances. Next thing you know, she's on nights, same as you, but for a solid month. She quit a week later." He shook his head. "Caldwell thinks he owns the place, owns everyone in it. Entitled son of a bitch." Randy paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He had his eye on some girl from accounting once, pretty thing. Heard she just disappeared after a while. Nobody saw her go." Dan kept his face neutral, the cold air biting at his lungs. He committed every word to memory. Later that night, hidden in the cramped bathroom of their house, he transcribed the details into a small, spiral-bound notebook he kept tucked under his mattress. The chilling mention of the girl from accounting, the pattern with Lisa. When he related all to Emily, her initial horror hardened into something cold and resolute. The unspoken fear in their house now had a name, a shape. Dan settled into the punishing routine at Grain Belt Meats. Each morning, his muscles screamed in protest, a deep ache permeating his shoulders and back from lifting heavy cartons of frozen meat. The cold in the loading dock became a constant companion, seeping into his bones. His mind, however, remained sharp, his ears always open. He observed the quiet hierarchy, the unspoken rules. Keep your head down, don't cause trouble. And most importantly, don't cross the Caldwells. They owned this factory and half the town along with it. Their influence was a silent, pervasive force. During breaks, Dan started to probe subtly. He'd bring up Caldwell's name, casual as a comment on the weather. "He seems to know his way around," Dan might say, watching for reactions. The responses were telling. A quick glance away, a sudden change of topic, a tightening around the eyes. He noticed a distinct pattern among the female staff. Hushed warnings, quick, meaningful looks exchanged when Caldwell walked by. Male coworkers would often offer a gruff, "Just stay out of his way. He's trouble," if he asked directly about Caldwell's demeanor. Emily, working her own grueling night shifts at Heartland Logistics, shared more details each morning when Dan woke her before he left for work. Caldwell's tactics were escalating, becoming less subtle. He'd accidentally brush against her in the narrow aisles. He'd leave a personalized note on her workstation about expecting loyalty from his best employees. He'd stand too close when explaining a delivery route, his presence looming. It was a constant, low-level hum of intimidation. At Grain Belt, Dan befriended a few older, jaded workers. Men like Frank, a forklift operator with a perpetually tired face and a deep-seated cynicism. They spoke in low tones about the Caldwell family's long reign, the way they'd built their empire on the backs of cheap labor and an iron fist. "They run this town," Frank had muttered one afternoon, leaning against a stack of empty pallets. "Always have, always will." Through these conversations, Dan pieced together a clearer picture of Caldwell's reputation. "He likes to rotate him," another worker, Gus, confided during lunch. "New pretty face comes in, they say no. Next thing you know, she's on nights, working with the ghosts. Happens again and again." Gus didn't need to say no to what. The implication hung heavy in the air. Rumors also circulated about hush money. Employees who left abruptly, after what were vaguely referred to as incidents, often seemed to disappear without a trace, only for whispers of substantial severance packages to follow. Enough to keep him quiet, Gus had said, shaking his head. Old man Caldwell, Steve's dad, he's good at that, cleaning up messes. Dan kept an eye out for anyone who might know more about these special payments. He eventually found Old Man Johnson, a security guard who had been with the Caldwells for decades. Johnson was a loyalist, slow-moving but sharp-eyed, always stationed near the main entrance. Dan approached him cautiously, offering coffee during a late shift. Johnson, appreciative, reminisced about the old days. Mr. Caldwell, Sr., he kept a tight ship, knew everything that went on, especially the important stuff, had a special ledger for certain transactions, kept it in his office, safe, always. Johnson's eyes darted away, a hint of discomfort in them, but he said no more. Still, it was a lead, a ledger. Fueled by Dan's findings, Emily, working her own night shifts, became more proactive. She started carrying a small notebook, jotting down dates and times of Caldwell's inappropriate comments or actions. She'd pretend to be checking inventory, but her mind was cataloging, documenting. The moral tension in their home grew, a silent weight settling over their shared meals. Dan witnessed Caldwell's behavior firsthand at Grainbelt. A new hire, a young woman named Sarah, started in packaging. Caldwell, on one of his rare tours of the floor, stopped to supervise her. He leaned over her shoulder too close, talking dismissively about her speed, his words laced with a condescending charm. Sarah's discomfort was clear, her shoulders hunched. The pattern was undeniable, ongoing. Dan knew he needed more than rumors. He needed direct confirmation. He remembered Randy mentioning a former employee, Brenda, who had been transferred to nights and then left suddenly. After a few days of discreet inquiries, he got her number. He called her from a payphone at a truck stop, his voice low, careful. Brenda's voice on the other end was initially terrified. "Who is this? How did you get my number?" She sounded brittle, on edge. He explained vaguely that he worked at Grainbelt, that he was trying to understand some things. "They made it clear," she whispered, her voice cracking. "If I ever said a word, they'd make sure I never worked in this town again. They knew where my kids went to school." Dan reassured her, his voice steady, calm. "I'm not asking for a statement yet, Brenda. Just confirmation. Did Steve Caldwell harass you? Did he make you uncomfortable?" He promised anonymity, swore he wouldn't use her name. He just needed to know if the pattern was true, if others had gone through it. There was a long silence, then a ragged sigh. "Yes," she finally said, the word barely audible. Yes, he did. With Brenda's confirmation, Dan started building a timeline in his hidden notebook. Names, dates, incidents. Lisa, Brenda, the girl from accounting, Sarah. The pieces clicked into place, forming a clear predatory history. The evidence, though circumstantial, was beginning to mount. Brenda, her voice still shaky over the phone, finally gave Dan a sliver of hope. "There was an old email account," she whispered, "used for HR stuff. Before they changed systems, HR archive, something like that. Nobody uses it now, but sometimes things don't really disappear, you know?" It wasn't much, a coded message veiled in fear, but Dan understood. She was pointing to a digital ghost, a forgotten corner where secrets might still reside. The problem was access. Dan was a grunt on the warehouse floor, miles away from the quiet, air-conditioned offices. He needed to get past the loading docks, past the packaging lines, and into the administrative areas. He couldn't just walk in there. He started brainstorming, his mind working through every scenario. He needed a legitimate reason, even if temporary, to be close to the offices. Emily, meanwhile, was noticing things from her end at Heartland Logistics. Caldwell seemed unusually preoccupied with the company's digital security logs. She'd seen him in the IT closet, whispering to the tech guy. He was covering his tracks, tightening the digital perimeter. Dan decided on a calculated risk. One morning, while wrestling a particularly stubborn pallet of frozen beef, he let out a sharp cry, doubling over. "Tweaked my back," he groaned to Randy, grimacing. The pain was real, a dull throb that had been building for weeks, but he exaggerated it for effect. The warehouse foreman, a burly man named Dave, took one look at Dan's pained face and the limp he adopted. "All right, Miller, Light duty for a few days. We need help in inventory, upstairs. Closer to the offices. Mostly scanning, no heavy lifting. It was a relief and a victory. The change in scenery was stark. The inventory office was a quiet, fluorescent-lit space, separated from the main administrative wing by a single glass door. From there, Dan could observe Caldwell's routine. He noted when Caldwell left his office for lunch, when the IT staff, a pair of nervous young men, were present in the server room down the hall. Caldwell's office door was usually ajar, but the computer screen inside was almost always dark or locked. It became clear that gaining direct access to Caldwell's machine was likely impossible. It would be password protected, locked down. But the mention of a shared network drive or that old server Brenda hinted at offered a different path. Dan remembered Mitch. Mitch was his buddy from Midwest Builders, a quiet guy with a knack for computers. He could probably crack open a bank vault with a laptop and a steady Wi-Fi signal. If Dan could get temporary access to a workstation, even for a few minutes, Mitch might be able to help remotely, digging into the older, less secure parts of the network. Emily's discoveries continued to fuel Dan's resolve. "I think it's called HR Archive at heartland.com, she confirmed one morning, her voice low. Caldwell got really agitated when the IT guy mentioned it, said it was legacy data, not relevant. That was the key. Legacy data meant old, perhaps unmonitored. That was the treasure trove. Emily also provided a crude map of her office layout based on memory. The old server room, I think it's where they store the backups. It's down a narrow hallway, past the break room. It's usually unlocked during night shifts. Dan spotted his chance during a late-night inventory check. The task required him to be on the admin floor, counting smaller items stored in a forgotten corner near the unused break room. The rest of the floor would be deserted, the IT guys long gone. He would have a window. He planned a risky, quick excursion during his shift break. A few minutes, that's all he'd need. Enough time to plug in a small USB device, establish a remote connection for Mitch. The weight of Emily's trust, the other victim's silence, pressed on him. He felt it in his aching back, in the tight knot in his stomach. He wasn't just doing this for Emily anymore. He was doing it for Lisa, for Brenda, for the girl from accounting who disappeared. He was doing it because someone had to. During his designated break, Dan slipped into the administrative area. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow over empty desks. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the quiet. He moved quickly, guided by Emily's memory of the layout, past the break room, down a narrow, forgotten hall. There, tucked away in a dusty closet, was the old server rack. It hummed softly, a faint blue light indicating it was still running, a forgotten relic of an older system. Physical access. That's what he needed. He pulled the small USB stick Mitch had given him from his pocket. It was loaded with specialized software designed to bypass basic network security to mirror data quickly. His fingers trembled slightly as he plugged it into an available port on the server. The screen displayed lines of code scrolling fast. He navigated through the archaic system, searching for the HR Archive account. Every second felt like an hour. The air was thick with tension, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of his pulse. He found it. He initiated the data transfer, mirroring the entire contents of the account yet onto the USB. Just as the progress bar crept to 80%, a distant rattle echoed down the hall. A janitor's cart. Dan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He yanked the USB stick out, tucking it deep into the steel-toed boot he wore. He pressed himself against the server rack, behind a stack of old printer boxes, trying to blend into the shadows. The rattling grew louder, then faded as the cart passed by the main hallway, heading in the opposite direction. He held his breath for another long moment, then slowly exhaled. He escaped unseen, the precious data hidden against his ankle. After his shift, the first hint of dawn painting the sky a pale gray, Dan bypassed going home. He drove his old Impala to a remote spot near the reservoir, a quiet patch of gravel overlooking the still water. He pulled out his battered laptop, the USB stick. He wasn't taking any chances on their home network being compromised. The archive was a treasure trove, old complaints, some barely veiled, about Steve Caldwell's inappropriate behavior. Emails from Caldwell's father, terse and to the point, detailing employee transition plans, and reputation management strategies. With scanned copies of severance agreements signed by former employees, complete with non-disclosure clauses and hefty sums. It was all there. He found Lisa's file, a clear record of her forced transfer to the night shift after an unsubstantiated performance review. Then, a more chilling discovery, the disappeared accounting girl. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. Her file included a settlement agreement signed by her parents for a sum that would have bought a small house. There were multiple other similar incidents, a sickening pattern repeating itself over the years. Caldwell's father, the influential patriarch, had always been the cleanup man, keeping everything quiet, buying silence with money and veiled threats. He shared the findings with Emily that evening, the laptop screen casting an eerie glow on their faces. Her initial horror was visible, a tightening of her features, but it was quickly replaced by a grim validation. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice tight. "I just knew it. The way he looked at me, the way he acted. This is worse than I thought." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the discovery settling around them. They now understood the true extent of the cover-up, the powerful forces they were up against. It cemented their resolve. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. Tom's month of leave was almost up. The window for his undercover operation was closing. They had the evidence, but now they needed a concrete plan of action. "We could confront him," Emily suggested, her eyes wide with a desperate kind of hope. "Show him what we have." Tom shook his head. "He'd just destroy it or spin it. He has too much power, too many connections." They knew confronting Caldwell directly was a dead end. They had to leak the information. But to whom? The local police force, they both knew, was too intertwined with the Caldwell family. The mayor, the judges, even some of the local businessmen. Caldwell's father had spent decades weaving that web of influence. They needed someone outside, someone with the leverage to actually act. Tom and Emily spent a sleepless night, the glow of the bedside lamp the only witness to their debate. The Caldwells, they both knew, were untouchable in Harmony. Their power ran too deep, too wide. Going to an out-of-town investigative journalist or a state labor board felt like throwing a match into dry tinder. The explosion would be public, messy, and the retaliation swift and sure. Their jobs, their quiet life, would be gone. "What about his father?" Emily suggested, her voice barely a whisper in the dark room. "Old Mr. Caldwell. He built this company. He cares about the family name, the legacy, more than he cares about Steve's predilections." Tom was wary. The old man was known for his ruthlessness, his ability to bury problems. But Emily pressed on. "It's our best shot at keeping our jobs, Tom. He wouldn't want a public scandal either. He'd want to handle it quietly." They drafted an anonymous letter. It was carefully worded, factual, detailing the archive's findings. Lisa's transfer, Sarah Jenkins' settlement, the pattern of silence bought with severance. They gave Mr. Caldwell a deadline, a polite but firm threat. Address Steve's conduct, or the full story with all the evidence would go public. The next day, Tom drove 2 counties over to a small post office in a town called Greenview, dropping the letter into the mailbox. He hoped the distance would obscure their tracks. Days crawled by, agonizingly slow. At Heartland Logistics, there was no visible change in Steve Caldwell's behavior. He was still the same oily, condescending presence, still casting those knowing glances at Emily. But then, a subtle shift occurred. Emily noticed old Mr. Caldwell, a rare sight in the bustling office, making an unannounced visit. He was a stoic man, his face a roadmap of hard years, and his presence cast a sudden, heavy pall over the usual office chatter. The tension in the office became palpable. Steve Caldwell, usually so self-assured, seemed agitated. Emily saw him pacing in his glass-walled office, taking private calls, his voice low and urgent. Something was brewing. Tom's last day as Dan Miller at Grainbelt Meats arrived. He made a clean exit, turning in his badge and equipment, a mix of relief and anxiety churning in his gut. The physical toll of the work was over, but the psychological burden remained. He reverted to Tom, back at Midwest Builders, trying to act normal, to blend back into his old routine. But his mind was still on the Caldwell situation, the ticking clock of their deadline. That evening, Emily endured a particularly difficult shift. Steve Caldwell's eyes followed her movements, a silent, menacing warning in their depths. It was more intense than before, a direct, predatory gaze that made her skin crawl. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Later that night, as she was winding down, an email popped up on her personal laptop. The sender was unknown, the subject line blank. She clicked it open, her heart skipping a beat. A single line of text. "He knows, be careful." The words hit them both like a physical blow. Their anonymous letter hadn't achieved its intended outcome. It hadn't sparked a quiet intervention. Instead, it had made Steve Caldwell aware of an internal leak, a breach in his carefully constructed web of silence. The "he knows" could only refer to Steve. He hadn't been reined in, he had been alerted. Tom and Emily looked at each other across the dim kitchen table, the laptop screen still glowing between them. The game had changed. The line in the sand had been drawn, and they were firmly on one side, with the Caldwells on the other. They prepared for the inevitable confrontation, a sense of dread mingling with a fierce resolve. They understood that their lives in harmony, their passives, their very security, might never be the same again. This was a costly choice they had made. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The next morning the call came. Emily was to report to Steve Caldwell's office at 9. Tom waited at home, the coffee maker humming, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Every minute stretched in agonizing silence. In the sterile confines of Steve Caldwell's office, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Caldwell sat behind his large mahogany desk, meticulously composed, his hands clasped, but his eyes were like flint. "Emily," he began, his voice dangerously even, "we have received reports of you spreading malicious rumors and displaying insubordination. This kind of behavior is not tolerated at Heartland Logistics." He slid a printed document across the desk. It was a termination notice, citing the past false warnings about documentation errors, painting a picture of a disruptive, underperforming employee. He intended to cut her loose quietly, efficiently. Emily took a slow breath, her heart thudding, but her outward composure remained. She picked up the notice, her gaze steady. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice clear. "However, I also have documentation, extensive documentation, in fact, of a pattern of behavior." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "A pattern that involves you and other employees." She implied, without explicitly stating, that this evidence was safely outside the company, ready to be released if she was unjustly fired. Steve Caldwell's controlled smirk faltered. A flicker of something, a momentary panic crossed his eyes. He hadn't expected her to have leverage, to fight back with anything more than denial. He leaned forward, about to speak, when the door suddenly opened. But Mr. Caldwell walked in. His face was grim, etched with displeasure, and in his hand he clutched a crumpled, printed copy of the anonymous letter they had mailed. His gaze, colder and sharper than his son's, swept from Steve to Emily. "Thanks to an anonymous tip," the elder Caldwell stated, his voice a low growl, "I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing the old HR archives myself." He tossed the letter onto the desk, its edges crinkling. "And I found damning evidence, Stephen, much like the letter said." He turned his full attention to his son, his disgust palpable. "You have compromised this company, and more importantly, you have shamed the Caldwell name. Years of hard work, generations of reputation, all for your indiscretions." Steve tried to deny, to deflect, to bully. "Father, this is ridiculous. She's making it all up, trying to get ahead." He even glanced at Emily, a flash of pure malice in his eyes. But his father cut him off, his voice like tempered steel. "I've seen enough proof, Stephen. The settlements, the transfers, the coded complaints, it's all there." Mr. Caldwell made his decision, swift and final. "You are immediately removed from your position, Stephen, effective immediately. You will undergo rehabilitation, away from harmony, indefinitely." Steve's face went white, a mixture of shock and fury. Then the elder Caldwell turned to Emily. His expression softened, if only slightly. "As for you, Ms. Anderson, I apologize for what you have endured. We will ensure this never happens again. He offered her a substantial promotion, a significant raise, and assurances of a clean, safe workplace. Consider it a testament to your integrity. Emily, despite the relief washing over her, hadn't forgotten the others. I appreciate that, Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice still steady. But this isn't just about me. Lisa, Brenda, the other women who were forced out, silenced. They deserve justice too, or at least compensation. Mr. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked at the anonymous letter, then at his son's stunned face. He understood the depth of the problem, the potential for a public scandal still lurking. He sighed, a heavy sound. Very well, Ms. Anderson. We will address those matters. Each one. Emily walked out of the office, bruised by the encounter, but undeniably victorious. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, the air lighter. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, and called Tom. It's over, she whispered, the relief finally breaking through. He's gone. Tom picked Emily up in the Heartland Logistics parking lot. She walked out of the building, her shoulders slightly less hunched, her steps a little lighter. In the quiet of the Impala, they embraced, a long, wordless squeeze that spoke volumes. The knot in Tom's stomach began to loosen, and he felt the immense weight of the last weeks slowly start to lift from both of them. Word of Steve Caldwell's sudden leave of absence for personal reasons spread like wildfire through Heartland Logistics and Grainbelt Meats. The official story was vague, carefully crafted, but the knowing glances and hushed conversations told a different tale. A subtle shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Back at Grainbelt, Randy, the veteran loader, saw Tom, now back to being Tom, not Dan Miller, during a delivery drop-off. He offered a knowing nod, his grizzled face conveying a silent acknowledgement of a battle won. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. Emboldened by Steve Caldwell's downfall, other women who had suffered his harassment slowly began to come forward, privately contacting Mr. Caldwell's newly appointed HR contact. Lisa, the shipping clerk, and Brenda, the former employee, were among the first. True to his word, old Mr. Caldwell offered financial settlements and new opportunities to them, ensuring their silence but also offering a measure of justice. The settlements were generous, enough to start over. Emily accepted her promotion, stepping into her new role with a cautious eye. She understood that trust needed to be rebuilt, not just assumed. The immediate aftermath was fraught with subtle tensions. Some co-workers, those who had perhaps benefited from Steve Caldwell's patronage, harbored resentment towards Emily's sudden rise. Others, however, quietly applauded her courage, their relief visible in their interactions. Tom returned to Midwest Builders full-time, finding a familiar comfort in the straightforward labor of construction. The clear-cut tasks, the tangible results, were a welcome change from the murky world of deceit and covert operations. Yet, he was forever changed by his undercover experience. He saw the world and the people in it with a sharper, more critical eye. Their financial struggles, a constant background hum of worry for so long, eased significantly. Emily's increased salary, combined with Tom's steady income, allowed them to finally manage his mother's ongoing medical bills without the crushing, constant worry. They could breathe a little easier. However, the emotional toll remained. Both Emily and Tom carried scars from the fear, the deceit, and the moral compromises they had endured. The experience had forged them, but it had also left them wary. They found themselves more protective of each other, more watchful of their surroundings. Their view of Harmony, Ohio, once a simple, comforting place, was forever altered, now tinged with the knowledge of its hidden shadows. The town buzzed with whispers, trying to make sense of the powerful Caldwell family's sudden shakeup. The official story of Steve's leave held, but the undercurrents of speculation ran deep. Most people in Harmony preferred not to dig too deep, to accept the surface narrative. Understanding they needed to process the trauma of the past months, Tom and Emily started going to counseling, meeting with a therapist a town over. It was a place where they could unpack the fear, the anger, the lingering unease without judgment. Slowly, cautiously, they began to rebuild their connection, finding strength in their shared ordeal and mutual support. The fear of retaliation slowly receded, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and a renewed appreciation for their simple, hard-won life. Months later, Harmony, Ohio, slowly adjusted. The air at Heartland Logistics felt lighter, a subtle but palpable change. Emily thrived in her new role, working to implement policies that ensured a safer, more respectful workplace for everyone. She became a quiet advocate, a steady presence, offering support to new hires, determined no one else would fall victim to similar abuse. Tom continued his work at Midwest Builders, a reliable pillar for his family. He also found himself more engaged in local community issues, quietly supporting small, justice-oriented initiatives. Their small home filled with laughter once more, a deeper, more profound appreciation for their quiet life settling in. Tom's mother's health improved, a source of immense relief and gratitude. They occasionally heard rumors of Steve Caldwell's rehabilitation efforts, always from afar, always confirming he hadn't returned to Harmony. Old Mr. Caldwell, still influential, worked to repair the company's reputation, showing a rare, almost vulnerable side in his later years. Tom and Emily knew justice had been served, but the price was high, demanding personal sacrifices and leaving emotional scars. Their love story, once simple, was now forged in fire, stronger and more resilient. Life in Harmony continued, bearing the echoes of their struggle, a testament to the quiet strength of ordinary people. Months later, Harmony, Ohio, slowly readjusted. The air at Heartland Logistics felt lighter, the tension gone. Emily thrived in her new role, implementing policies for a safer workplace. She became a quiet advocate, supporting new hires and ensuring no one else fell victim. Tom continued at Midwest Builders, a reliable pillar. He also became more engaged in local issues, quietly supporting justice. Their family life stabilized, laughter returning to their small home with a deeper appreciation. Tom's mother's health improved, a source of immense relief. They occasionally heard rumors of Steve Caldwell's rehabilitation, always from afar, confirming his absence. Mr. Caldwell, still influential, worked to repair the company's reputation, a rare vulnerability in his later years. Tom and Emily realized justice came at a high price, demanding personal sacrifices and emotional scars. They reflected on morality in a small town where power created its own rules and the courage it took to challenge them. Their love story, once simple, was now forged in fire, stronger and more resilient. They learned true strength wasn't just fighting, it was about healing and authentic living. Emily sometimes exchanged knowing smiles with Lisa or Brenda, a silent bond. Tom occasionally thought of Dan Miller, a different man in a different world, but the lessons remained. Life in Harmony, Ohio continued, bearing the echoes of their struggle, a testament to the quiet strength of ordinary people. The end.